Imagine this: a woman standing in the middle of a collapsing empire, surrounded by enemies, betrayal, and a world that had no space for her. Egypt was bleeding power. Rome, the unstoppable superpower, cast its shadow across the Mediterranean. And yet, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was about to prove that one mind, one vision, and one fearless heart could defy history itself. She wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature, a strategist whose brilliance terrified men who had conquered nations, and the story of her life is as intoxicating as it is brutal. Cleopatra was born into a dynasty known for intrigue, ambition, and betrayal. Ptolemaic Egypt was a kingdom of golden temples, bustling trade, and unimaginable wealth. But beneath the surface, her family's thirst for power was insatiable. Brothers and sisters killed each other for thrones. Alliances shifted overnight. Loyalty was a currency, betrayal the price. To survive, Cleopatra had to learn the harshest lesson of all: power doesn't come from birthright. It comes from intelligence, audacity, and the courage to bend the rules of a male-dominated world. At 17, Cleopatra became co-ruler of Egypt, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. But this was no ceremonial title. Her brother and his advisors wanted to sideline her, to make her a figurehead, while they pulled the strings. Cleopatra refused. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the soul of Egypt, and she had no army, no allies in Rome, and a court filled with spies. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Then came Julius Caesar. Imagine this: Rome's most powerful man arrives on your doorstep, an empire builder feared across the known world, and suddenly the survival of your kingdom and perhaps your life depends on an alliance with him. Cleopatra, daring and audacious, arranged a meeting that would go down in history. Legend says she smuggled herself into the palace rolled up in a carpet, delivered personally to Caesar's chambers. It sounds almost cinematic because every detail mattered. Every move was a gamble. One misstep and her life and Egypt would be destroyed. But Cleopatra didn't gamble blindly. She understood Rome. She understood Caesar. She understood power. And she turned the encounter to her advantage. Within days, she became his confidant, his political ally, and according to history, his lover. Together, they orchestrated strategies that stabilized her rule, defeated her enemies, and sent a clear message. Cleopatra would not be ignored. Her genius, however, went far beyond charm or ambition. Cleopatra was a polyglot, fluent in multiple languages, a scholar who studied mathematics, philosophy, and politics. She negotiated treaties that outsmarted generals and ambassadors who thought themselves wiser than kings, and she never relied solely on brute force. She wielded influence, persuasion, and intellect like a blade sharper than any sword. But the world she navigated was merciless. Caesar's assassination in 44 BC shook Rome and left Cleopatra exposed. Suddenly her protector was gone, the political tides were unpredictable, and her throne was under threat once again. That's when she met Mark Antony, a man as ambitious, passionate, and dangerous as herself. Their alliance was more than romance. It was a calculated partnership in survival and power. Together, they challenged Octavian, Rome's rising star, and set the stage for a war that would decide the fate of empires. Cleopatra's life was defined by extremes: triumph and peril, love and betrayal, beauty and intelligence. Every decision was a calculated risk, and the cost of failure was always death, or worse, the erasure of her legacy. Yet she thrived. She became a symbol, a legend, and a warning to the world that underestimated women, underestimated Egypt, underestimated the power of strategy and courage. Even today, her story resonates because it embodies the eternal struggle. How does one wield power in a world that constantly seeks to strip it away? Cleopatra's brilliance lay in answering that question, not through armies or riches alone, but through mastery of perception, alliances, and timing. Rome feared her not because she was a queen, but because she was unstoppable. She became the final, unbroken link to the grandeur of ancient Egypt, a civilization that had ruled the world for millennia. Her name still carries a weight that transcends time. Cleopatra represents audacity, intelligence, survival against impossible odds. She haunts history, not because of myths or Hollywood tales, but because she truly lived them, fearlessly, unapologetically, and with a clarity of purpose that even the greatest generals could not match. And that's why we start here, at the beginning of everything, not with legends, not with romances, not with the stories Rome wanted you to hear, but with Cleopatra herself, the queen who refused to bow, the strategist who played empires like chess, and the woman who understood one unshakable truth: power is never given. It's taken, molded, and defended at every turn. Because when Cleopatra walked the halls of Alexandria, she didn't just see a kingdom. She saw the world, and she refused to let it slip from her grasp. Imagine this: a land of golden temples, bustling harbors, and endless deserts, yet beneath the splendor, a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse. Egypt, the jewel of the ancient world, was a place where wealth and culture flourished, but power had grown brittle. For centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled, a family of Macedonian origin that had blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. They had built monumental cities, filled libraries with priceless scrolls, and amassed wealth beyond imagination. But the internal rout was undeniable. The Ptolemies were a dynasty defined by betrayal. Sibling rivalry was not just common, it was expected. Brothers murdered brothers, sisters deposed sisters, and anyone with ambition was fair game. Alliances shifted like sand in the desert winds. Power was never stable, and survival was never guaranteed. To be born into royalty in Ptolemaic Egypt was to inherit luxury. Yes, but also danger. Every smile in the court could conceal a dagger. Every ally could be plotting your downfall. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, Egypt was already vulnerable. Its economy was strained. The Nile, lifeline of the kingdom, had become unpredictable, and the granaries could no longer feed the population as reliably as before. The kingdom's borders were under pressure from ambitious neighbors, mercenary armies, and most perilously Rome. The republic across the Mediterranean was expanding aggressively, its generals conquering lands, reshaping nations, and demanding loyalty. Egypt was wealthy, yes, but wealth alone could not protect it from conquest. Inside the palace, life was no less treacherous. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was a ruler whose reign was marked by extravagance and political miscalculations. He bought loyalty from Rome with gold and diplomacy, yet failed to unify his own people. The court was rife with conspiracies, with ministers plotting coups and courtiers scheming for personal gain. Cleopatra grew up witnessing betrayal as a constant, lethal reality. To survive, she learned early that intellect and cunning mattered more than brute force or birthright. Every lesson in politics, every lesson in human nature, was written in danger. The Ptolemies had also alienated the Egyptian populace. The Greek rulers clung to their Hellenistic customs, often disregarding the traditions, religion, and culture of native Egyptians. Temples were maintained, yes, but often as symbols of Greek authority rather than genuine religious devotion. The people whispered, resented, and sometimes revolted. Cleopatra would inherit a kingdom divided, not just by family feuds, but by cultural fractures. She would need more than armies. She would need diplomacy, intelligence, and charisma to unify a fractured nation. And then there was Rome. By the late 1st century BC, Rome was no longer just a distant power. It was an unstoppable force reshaping the Mediterranean. Ptolemy XII had secured his throne by currying favor with Roman generals and politicians, paying tributes and forming precarious alliances. But Rome was impatient. Its leaders saw Egypt not as a sovereign kingdom, but as a prize to be won, a treasure to be exploited. Cleopatra would inherit a throne not merely challenged internally, but shadowed by the threat of invasion. Her reign would demand brilliance, courage, and daring on a scale no teenager had ever faced. Even within the palace walls, danger was relentless. Cleopatra's siblings were not just family, they were competitors. By the time she came of age, the young princess was already navigating a labyrinth of intrigue. She witnessed assassinations, exile, and betrayals that would have broken lesser minds. But instead, she absorbed every lesson. She learned to read people like books, to anticipate moves before they happened, to bend situations to her advantage. It was not education she learned from scholars, it was survival she learned from blood and fear. Egypt itself was a kingdom of contrasts. Its Nile-fed fields produced abundance, yet famine was always a looming threat. Its libraries and universities were centers of knowledge, yet ignorance and superstition persisted among the populace. The economy thrived on trade, yet corruption siphoned wealth from treasury to private hands. Cleopatra's genius would later lie in navigating these contrasts, in turning weakness into advantage, in reading the pulse of a nation and the ambitions of its rulers and its enemies. The military situation was just as precarious. Egypt's armies were formidable in theory, but divided in loyalty, often poorly supplied, and reliant on mercenaries with shifting allegiances. Cleopatra would inherit generals loyal to her family name, but not necessarily to her. She would need to assert authority over them, win their respect, and sometimes outwit them, all while the shadow of Rome loomed over the horizon. And yet, in this chaos, there was an opportunity. Cleopatra was born into a kingdom on the edge. But edges are where visionaries emerge. The instability that had weakened her predecessors would become her advantage. The fractures in her family would teach her the tools of manipulation. The cultural divides of her kingdom would teach her the art of diplomacy. The threat of Rome would teach her strategy and risk calculation on an unprecedented scale. Cleopatra's Egypt was a tinderbox. Every decision carried weight. Every alliance, betrayal, or misstep could ignite flames that might consume her life and her people. Yet she thrived in this environment. Where others saw chaos, she saw opportunity. Where others saw threats, she saw tools to wield. By the time she stepped onto the stage of history, she had already mastered the art of navigating impossible odds. The stage was set. A kingdom fraught with internal and external threats. Siblings vying for the throne. Generals whose loyalty was never guaranteed. A populace divided, and the looming specter of Rome, ready to consume the weak. Cleopatra would not simply inherit a throne. She would inherit a battlefield of politics, culture, and survival. Every move she would make could determine not only her fate, but the fate of Egypt itself. And it is here, at this critical juncture, that Cleopatra's story begins. Not as a princess, not as a daughter, but as a future queen forged in a world designed to destroy her. The danger, the intrigue, the stakes, they were all real, and they would define her genius, her audacity, and her immortality in the annals of history. Egypt was on the edge. And Cleopatra was about to show the world that edges are where legends are born. Cleopatra didn't become a queen by chance. She became a queen because every day of her childhood was a lesson in survival, power, and intellect. From the moment she could walk the palace halls, she was immersed in a world where one misstep could cost her life. The Ptolemaic court was a crucible, a place where cunning mattered more than kindness, and strategy mattered more than strength. Her education was legendary, even for royalty. While most girls of her age were learning household skills or attending to ceremonial duties, Cleopatra was immersed in languages, philosophy, mathematics, and diplomacy. She would eventually speak at least 9 languages fluently: Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Aramaic, and others. But her mastery of languages was never about showing off. It was a weapon. She understood that speaking directly to people in their native tongue created trust, loyalty, and influence. By the time she was a teenager, she could negotiate with merchants in Alexandria, priests in Memphis, and diplomats from Rome without a translator, subtly shaping the outcomes of conversations before others even realized what had happened. But education was only the beginning. Cleopatra's childhood was marked by political turbulence. Her father, Ptolemy XII, relied on bribery and manipulation to maintain Egypt's independence from Rome, a strategy that made the family both powerful and hated. Cleopatra watched as siblings plotted against each other. She saw cousins and brothers exiled, imprisoned, or murdered. From them, she learned that royal blood was not protection. It was a target. Trust was rare. Loyalty was fragile, and power was never permanent. Every encounter became a test of observation, memory, and foresight. She learned to read expressions, anticipate intentions, and act before her rivals could even speak. Cleopatra's survival instincts were sharpened further by the Egyptian people she grew up among. Unlike her Greek-speaking court, the majority of Egypt's population spoke Egyptian and lived by traditions dating back millennia. She immersed herself in their culture, learned their religious practices, and demonstrated knowledge of their history. This wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was strategy. By understanding the heart of her kingdom, she would later be able to command loyalty in ways her predecessors never could. A queen who spoke to her people in their own language was far more dangerous than a distant ruler issuing decrees from marble halls. Her mentors were as diverse as her lessons. Scholars taught her mathematics and philosophy. Priests introduced her to religious rituals, astrology, and the sacred traditions that bound Egypt together. Generals gave her insight into military strategy. Merchants explained the intricacies of trade and finance. Cleopatra absorbed all of it. She became a sponge for knowledge, mastering subjects far beyond her years. By the time she was 16, she was not only politically savvy, but intellectually formidable, a young woman whose mind was already more lethal than the swords of the palace guards. Yet intellect alone was not enough. Cleopatra's beauty, charisma, and personal presence were cultivated deliberately. In a world where appearances could make or break alliances, she learned to command attention, to influence emotions, and to inspire devotion. Her charm was not superficial. It was a tool of survival, diplomacy, and negotiation. Every gesture, every word, every glance could sway decisions, change loyalties, or diffuse threats. She learned early that perception could be as powerful as armies, and she mastered it fully. Her childhood also taught her the cost of miscalculation. At one point, her father faced a rebellion in Alexandria. The young Cleopatra, only a child, witnessed the chaos, the fear, and the carnage. Soldiers looted, the palace trembled, and citizens rioted. From that day, she understood that leadership meant navigating crises where lives and legacies hung in the balance. The weight of responsibility became personal. She internalized the lesson. Hesitation could be fatal. Courage, decisiveness, and foresight were not optional. They were essential. But Cleopatra's training wasn't just academic or strategic. She learned resilience in ways that cannot be taught in classrooms. In her youth, the palace was infiltrated by spies, assassins, and rival factions seeking to destabilize the throne. She survived attempts at poisoning, exile threats, and betrayal by close relatives. Each encounter honed her instincts. Each crisis strengthened her resolve. By her teenage years, she had developed a psychological armor, a calm under fire, and the ability to turn even deadly situations into opportunities. She understood that fear could be weaponized against opponents, but also against oneself if unchecked. Her destiny was also shaped by ambition, her own, not that of others. Many Ptolemies assumed Cleopatra would marry a brother or cousin, remain a ceremonial figure, and follow tradition. But she refused to be a pawn. She watched, learned, and prepared to seize her own path. Cleopatra understood that destiny favored the prepared, the bold, and the strategic. Every moment of her youth was an investment in the queen she would become. She built alliances quietly, gathered intelligence about her siblings and rivals, and tested the limits of her influence. By 17, she was not just ready to ascend the throne, she was prepared to dominate it. Perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra's childhood instilled in her an understanding of timing. She learned that patience could be as lethal as force, that waiting for the perfect moment to act could decide the difference between triumph and death. She watched generals, priests, and diplomats miscalculate, seeing them fall while she observed from the shadows. Strategy was a living thing to her, a constant interplay of observation, patience, and execution. She honed it early, and it would later define her reign. By the time she stepped onto the throne, Cleopatra was not just a princess. She was a scholar, a strategist, a diplomat, a linguist, and a master of psychological warfare. She had survived family treachery, navigated a fractured kingdom, and absorbed lessons that would make even seasoned rulers pause. Her youth had been forged in pressure, her mind sharpened by intellect, her instincts honed by danger, and her spirit emboldened by ambition. Every element of her upbringing was preparing her for the impossible task ahead: to rule Egypt, stand against Rome, and secure her legacy as the last queen of a dying empire. And yet, the greatest tests were still to come. Cleopatra had learned the rules of power, the dangers of betrayal, and the art of survival. But she had not yet faced the challenge that would define her life, the collision of her kingdom with the greatest empire the world had ever seen. That test would push her beyond knowledge, beyond strategy, beyond ambition. It would demand genius, audacity, and a courage that few humans then or now could muster. Power in the Ptolemaic dynasty was never inherited. It was taken, fought for, and defended with cunning as sharp as any blade. Cleopatra learned this lesson early. In a palace where every smile could hide a dagger and every ally could be a traitor, her family was a web of ambition, deception, and deadly rivalry. And it was within this web that Cleopatra would discover the brutal truth. Survival sometimes demanded ruthlessness equal to intelligence. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was co-ruler in name, but in reality, he and his advisors sought to sideline Cleopatra, reduce her influence, and consolidate absolute control. Cleopatra, barely a teenager, quickly realized that she could not rely on others to protect her or her throne. The court whispered of poisoning, exile, and assassination. Every feast, every ceremony, Every meeting could conceal a trap. In this environment, Cleopatra's intellect and instincts became her weapons. She learned to read intentions, anticipate betrayal, and act before threats could materialize. One of the first major crises came when tensions between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII erupted into outright confrontation. Advisors, generals, and ministers took sides, fracturing the court into hostile factions. Cleopatra's supporters were few, but fiercely loyal. Her brother, fueled by arrogance and the encouragement of his advisors, believed her youth and gender made her weak. He was about to discover just how dangerous a seemingly young queen could be when backed by strategy, wit, and courage. The stakes were immense. Egypt's future, her life, and the stability of the throne all hung in the balance. Cleopatra understood that a direct confrontation with her brother could be fatal. Open conflict within the palace might destroy not only her rule, but the kingdom itself. So she employed tactics that were equal parts daring and cunning. She built alliances with key generals and court officials, cultivating loyalty not through fear, but through respect and shared vision. Every gesture, every word, and every calculated act was a move in a dangerous game of survival. When open hostilities broke out, Cleopatra was forced into exile. It was a harsh test of her resilience. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, became a city of enemies. Her brother controlled the palace, the treasury, and the army, leaving her with little more than her wits and the loyalty of a handful of supporters. But Cleopatra did not despair. She turned exile into strategy. She traveled discreetly, gathering intelligence, building alliances, and preparing to reclaim the throne. Every day in hiding was a lesson in patience, observation, and tactical precision. This period of betrayal and exile revealed another truth. In the world of power, perception could be as lethal as any army. Cleopatra's enemies believed her weak. They underestimated her, assuming that exile had broken her spirit. But Cleopatra understood human nature. She knew that underestimation was a weapon, a tool she could exploit to regain control. By projecting calculated vulnerability, she drew out opponents, gathered crucial intelligence, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Her return to power was audacious. Cleopatra re-entered Alexandria with the support of a loyalist faction and a carefully orchestrated plan. It was not brute force that secured her position. It was strategy, intelligence, and timing. She leveraged political alliances, the loyalty of the military, and her own charisma to outmaneuver Ptolemy XIII and his supporters. Battles were fought as much in the halls of the palace as on the streets, and Cleopatra proved that the pen, the mind, and the influence of allies could triumph over raw power. The conflict culminated in the siege of Alexandria, a dramatic showdown where familial loyalty, ambition, and survival collided. Cleopatra's brother, despite his military resources, was trapped by miscalculations and betrayal within his own ranks. Cleopatra's strategic brilliance ensured that when the final confrontation came, victory was decisive and irreversible. Ptolemy XIII, drowned in the Nile while attempting to escape, a stark reminder that in the ruthless world of dynastic power, hesitation could be fatal. This betrayal shaped Cleopatra in profound ways. She emerged not only as the ruler of Egypt, but as a woman who understood the fragility of trust, the necessity of intelligence, and the importance of foresight. Every subsequent alliance, every interaction with foreign powers, and every decision she would make carried the weight of this lesson. Cleopatra's ability to survive, adapt, and ultimately dominate a world filled with treachery was forged in the fires of family betrayal. From this point forward, Cleopatra's approach to power would always combine intellect, strategy, and emotional acuity. She learned that enemies could be friends if persuaded correctly, that loyalty could be built through respect, and that perception could be manipulated to achieve impossible goals. The betrayal of her own family taught her that in politics, trust was rare and preparation was everything. By the time she faced Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, Cleopatra had already been tested by the most brutal of circumstances. Her family's treachery had forced her to develop the psychological resilience, strategic foresight, and political acumen that would define her reign. The lessons of betrayal became tools, weapons, and shields. Cleopatra did not simply survive her early trials, she transformed them into a blueprint for absolute power. In the end, the wars within her own family were not merely personal struggles, they were training for empire. Cleopatra emerged as a queen who could navigate deception, leverage intelligence, and turn adversity into opportunity. The betrayal she endured shaped her into a ruler who understood that in the Game of Thrones, only the clever, the bold, and the ruthless could survive, and even fewer could thrive. Cleopatra's first true test as a ruler didn't come with a crown. It came with exile. She had been ousted from the palace by her brother Ptolemy XIII, and his advisors, forced to flee Alexandria with nothing but the loyalty of a few trusted supporters. At barely 18, she faced a stark reality: reclaim her throne or watch her kingdom crumble, her life extinguished, and her legacy erased before it even began. Survival would demand more than courage. It would demand brilliance, daring, and a mastery of strategy that few could match. Her first challenge was geography. Alexandria was a city of narrow streets, hidden alleys, and a population divided in loyalty. Ptolemy XIII's forces controlled the palace, the treasury, and key military positions. Cleopatra's escape had been calculated, but it was dangerous. Every step outside the relative safety of loyalist strongholds exposed her to assassination or capture. She moved swiftly, quietly, and with careful planning, ensuring that her every move was shielded from the eyes of spies and informants. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, became both a barrier and a tool in her strategy. Traveling along its waterways, she used the river's twists and currents to evade pursuers while establishing contact with allies downstream. During exile, Cleopatra didn't simply hide, she gathered intelligence. She spoke to local governors, military commanders, and merchants, subtly assessing who could be persuaded, who could be bought, and who would betray her. Every conversation was a test. Every interaction a calculation. She learned which factions were loyal, which were opportunistic, and which could be turned into instruments of her return. In these early weeks, she began mastering a skill that would define her reign: the ability to turn fragile alliances into decisive political leverage. Cleopatra also understood the psychological dimension of power. Rumors of her death, or her permanent exile, would weaken her position in Alexandria and embolden her enemies. She orchestrated messages and subtle leaks that suggested she was planning a comeback, keeping her brother and his advisors on edge. By controlling the narrative, she forced her opponents to make mistakes. They assumed she was powerless, yet she was the one manipulating perception, bending reality to her advantage. Her boldest move came when she sought external support. Cleopatra understood that her resources alone were insufficient to confront Ptolemy XIII's forces. She needed allies with both military power and political influence. Her eyes turned to Rome, the rising superpower whose generals could tip the scales. But gaining Rome's support was no simple task. The city was a labyrinth of political intrigue, where allegiances shifted as quickly as fortunes. Cleopatra would have to navigate these treacherous waters, presenting herself not as a desperate exile, but as a calculated leader capable of restoring stability and securing wealth for anyone who supported her cause. In preparation for her return, Cleopatra leveraged Egypt's geography to her advantage. She moved through strategic cities along the Nile Delta, rallying loyalists and gathering forces. Towns that had been ignored or marginalized by Ptolemy XIII's court were prime candidates for her message of restoration and justice. She promised stability, prosperity, and protection of traditional rights in exchange for loyalty. By the time she reached the outskirts of Alexandria, she had rebuilt a miniature power base capable of challenging her brother's control. When she finally returned to Alexandria, Cleopatra employed a mix of diplomacy and military strategy. She did not immediately confront Ptolemy XIII directly. Instead, she staged subtle demonstrations of strength, such as controlling key grain shipments and securing strategic positions along the city's canals. These moves sent a clear message. Cleopatra was not only back, but she was prepared to reclaim her throne by any means necessary. Her decisive moment came with the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII, confident in his superior numbers and fortified palace, underestimated Cleopatra's strategic acumen. She coordinated her forces, including loyalist troops and mercenary contingents, to exploit weaknesses in his defenses. The engagement was not merely physical, it was psychological. Cleopatra's forces created diversions, cut off supply routes, and used Metzerufen to confuse and demoralize the enemy. Within weeks, Ptolemy XIII's army was in disarray, and the balance of power shifted. Cleopatra's victory was as much about intelligence as it was about combat. She had survived exile not through brute force alone, but through meticulous planning, alliance building, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Every step she had taken, from the Nile's secret channels to the hearts of disaffected allies, had been part of a grand strategy to reclaim her throne. By the time her brother's forces collapsed, Cleopatra had proven she was not just a claimant to power. She was a ruler in her own right, capable of commanding armies, manipulating perception, and surviving the most dangerous political landscapes imaginable. Her return to power also reinforced a lesson that would guide her throughout her reign. Legitimacy in leadership is inseparable from the ability to inspire loyalty. Cleopatra's success was not merely the result of her intellect or charisma. It was the careful cultivation of trust, respect, and fear in the right measure. She understood that a ruler without loyalty is doomed, and she made sure that her supporters, from generals to palace officials, understood the stakes of their allegiance. This first battle for power shaped Cleopatra's approach to ruling Egypt. She emerged not only as a sovereign, but as a strategist who understood the fragility of power and the necessity of constant vigilance. Every subsequent alliance with Rome, every negotiation with generals, every maneuver against rivals carried the imprint of the lessons she learned during exile. Cleopatra had faced the crucible of danger, and she had emerged stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. By reclaiming the throne, Cleopatra transformed from a young princess into a queen who understood that survival and power were inseparable. She had navigated betrayal, mastered strategy, and returned stronger than her enemies could imagine. This victory was only the beginning, the opening chapter in a reign that would challenge the might of Rome, redefine diplomacy, and leave a legacy that endures to this day. History pivots on moments that seem almost impossible. The meeting of two minds, two destinies, and two worlds. Cleopatra's encounter with Julius Caesar was one of those moments. She was a young queen who had just reclaimed her throne after surviving exile and betrayal, standing against a backdrop of political chaos. Rome, the rising superpower, loomed large, and Caesar, its most formidable general, had arrived in Alexandria. It was a collision of ambition, intellect, and raw power that would alter the course of history. Cleopatra's entry into this encounter was audacious. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet, delivered by loyal servants into the Roman general's private quarters. It is a story told as a tale of romance, but it was far more a calculated act of strategy than seduction. She needed to appear unexpectedly, yet command authority. She needed to assert intelligence and resolve before charm could even play a role. Every detail mattered. One mistake could mean death, political annihilation, or worse, the erasure of Egypt's independence. Caesar, for all his military genius, was unprepared for Cleopatra's combination of intellect, charisma, and nerve. She spoke directly, confidently, and with an awareness that few Roman leaders encountered in their dealings with foreign monarchs. Cleopatra demonstrated that she was no ordinary queen. She was a sovereign capable of steering her kingdom, influencing powerful allies, and maneuvering enemies, all while projecting strength in a world dominated by men. Their alliance was as strategic as it was political. Cleopatra understood that her survival and the security of her throne depended on winning Caesar's support. Rome was the ultimate arbiter of Mediterranean power, and Caesar's favor could neutralize her enemies, stabilize her reign, and ensure Egypt's future. Yet, gaining his trust required more than gifts or flattery. Cleopatra had to present herself as a ruler with knowledge, foresight, and vision, someone whose alliance could bring tangible benefits to Rome, not just prestige. The Palace of Alexandria became the stage for a subtle but high-stakes chess game. Cleopatra's advisors coordinated with Roman officers, conveying messages that displayed Egypt's loyalty while hinting at the threats that could destabilize the region if Caesar did not intervene. Cleopatra herself engaged in direct discussions with Caesar, demonstrating fluency in diplomacy, negotiation, and psychological insight. Every conversation was calculated, every gesture measured. She wasn't playing for affection, she was playing for survival and supremacy. Her intelligence and preparation were extraordinary. Cleopatra had studied Rome carefully, its politics, its generals, its senators, its culture. She anticipated Caesar's reactions, predicted objections, and preempted challenges. By speaking to him in terms that appealed to Roman ambition, territorial expansion, wealth, and political advantage, she positioned herself not as a subject, but as an equal, a partner whose alliance could amplify Caesar's power rather than threaten it. The result was immediate and transformative. Cleopatra regained her throne with Caesar's support, forcing her brother Ptolemy XIII into a position where he could no longer claim authority. The Alexandrian War, a brief but decisive conflict, saw Cleopatra's forces, aided by Roman legions, outmaneuver and ultimately defeat Ptolemy XIII's army. In the end, her brother drowned in the Nile, a stark reminder of the deadly stakes of royal rivalry. Cleopatra's triumph was both political and personal, a complete reversal from exile to undisputed queen, solidified by Rome's recognition. But the encounter with Caesar was about more than the throne. It marked the beginning of a relationship that intertwined personal, political, and strategic interests. Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar, her son, whose parentage tied her dynasty directly to Rome's most powerful man. This alliance, both symbolic and practical, would shape Cleopatra's reign and the future of Egypt. Caesar's support ensured not only her survival, but also her ability to enact policies, reform administration, and stabilize a kingdom that had been on the brink of collapse. Cleopatra's brilliance lay in understanding that power extended beyond armies and wealth. It was influence, perception, and timing. She transformed the encounter with Caesar into a masterclass in diplomacy, turning a precarious situation into an unassailable advantage. She understood the balance of fear and respect, charm and authority, intellect and instinct, and she wielded it flawlessly. Her reign after the Caesar encounter also demonstrated another layer of strategic genius. Cleopatra consolidated power by reforming economic policies, strengthening the navy, and ensuring loyalty among generals and administrators. The kingdom recovered stability, wealth flowed through Alexandria, and her political influence extended into the corridors of Rome. Yet she never allowed complacency. Every step was calculated, every alliance monitored, every rival kept in check. Cleopatra's encounter with Caesar was not a romantic fairy tale. It was a calculated, high-stakes gambit that reshaped the Mediterranean world. She emerged not only as Egypt's queen, but as a player on the global stage, commanding respect, loyalty, and fear. This meeting cemented her status as a sovereign whose intelligence rivaled her contemporaries, a strategist capable of shaping the destiny of empires. In the end, Cleopatra's success with Caesar reveals the essence of her genius. She understood that power was never static. It required action, foresight, and a willingness to seize opportunities when they arose. By combining intellect, audacity, and strategic insight, she turned a meeting with one of history's greatest generals into a lifelong advantage for herself and her kingdom. The encounter would not only secure her throne, but also set the stage for the next chapter of her life, one defined by romance, war, and the ultimate struggle for survival against the might of Rome itself. Cleopatra's visit to Rome was more than a journey. It was a calculated display of power, intellect, and diplomacy that left the empire astounded. She arrived in the heart of the Roman Republic at a time when politics was a battlefield where alliances could make or destroy men overnight. Senators whispered, generals plotted, and Rome's population buzzed with curiosity about the young queen from the exotic lands of the Nile. Cleopatra understood that perception was as lethal as a legion. Her appearance, her words, her demeanor, all were weapons she wielded with precision. Unlike many foreign monarchs who sought Rome's favor through submission or tribute, Cleopatra entered with confidence. She projected authority, intellect, and cultural sophistication, demonstrating that she was no mere exotic curiosity. She spoke Latin fluently, engaged in debates, and navigated the labyrinthine politics of the Senate with grace and strategy. Every gesture, every smile, every word was calculated to impress, influence, and command. The Queen of Egypt was not asking for support. She was asserting that Rome would benefit by aligning with her. Her relationship with Julius Caesar added an unprecedented layer to her strategy. Their personal alliance had deep political implications. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, symbolized a bond between Egypt and Rome that could not be ignored. By positioning herself close to Caesar, Cleopatra ensured protection for her kingdom, access to Roman intelligence, and influence over decisions that could shape the Mediterranean. Yet she also understood the delicate balance. Too much dependence on Rome could compromise her authority back home. Her genius was in maintaining control while leveraging Rome's power to solidify her reign. Cleopatra's stay in Rome also tested her ability to survive intrigue on a global scale. Rival politicians and ambitious senators saw her as a threat, an exotic temptress whose influence could destabilize the Republic. Rumors spread, alliances were tested, and Cleopatra had to navigate a political minefield while ensuring that her kingdom remained secure. She relied not on brute force, but on intellect, charm, and subtle manipulation of perception. Every interaction was measured, every alliance scrutinized, every challenge anticipated. Her presence in Rome also served as a demonstration of Egypt's sophistication and strength. Cleopatra showcased the wealth of Alexandria, the cultural achievements of her kingdom, and the intelligence of her administration. She displayed that Egypt was not a passive client state, but a thriving, independent power capable of negotiation, strategy, and diplomacy. By doing so, she elevated her standing among Rome's elite and reminded them that any alliance with her was an investment in influence and wealth. Yet, Cleopatra's time in Rome was not only political, it was a masterclass in survival. The city was rife with danger for a foreign queen. Assassination, betrayal, and political maneuvering were constant threats. Cleopatra navigated this world with the same precision she had used to reclaim her throne in Egypt. She built relationships, assessed allies and enemies, and ensured that her reputation was untouchable. Every action was a calculated step towards securing both her personal safety and the longevity of her kingdom. Her intelligence and foresight during this period had long-lasting consequences. Cleopatra's interactions with Rome shaped how she would handle Mark Antony later, how she would navigate the shifting tides of Roman power, and how she would maintain Egypt's independence in a world increasingly dominated by imperial forces. She proved that a ruler's strength is not measured solely by armies or riches, but by the ability to read situations, anticipate threats, and turn challenges into opportunities. Moreover, Cleopatra understood the power of legacy. She carefully curated how Rome perceived her, ensuring that her image, intelligent, regal, and formidable, would endure. While myths of seduction often overshadow the historical record, the reality was that Cleopatra's brilliance lay in her strategic acumen, her mastery of political theater, and her ability to influence one of the most powerful men in the world. Her so-called charm was only one layer of a much deeper strategy of survival and domination. By the time Cleopatra left Rome, she had achieved more than political alliances. She had secured her kingdom's future, enhanced her personal authority, and demonstrated to the world that a queen of Egypt could operate on the same level as the most powerful men in history. She returned to Alexandria with her reputation intact, her throne secure, and her strategic vision sharpened for the conflicts and alliances that would define the next decade of her reign. Cleopatra's Roman experience was a turning point. She had navigated a foreign capital filled with intrigue and danger, gained influence over the most powerful empire of the era, and learned lessons about diplomacy, perception, and survival that would guide her for the rest of her life. The queen who had survived exile, familial betrayal, and palace intrigue now faced the ultimate challenge, maintaining Egypt's sovereignty while maneuvering between the ambitions of Rome's greatest generals. Her story in Rome reminds us that power is never just about conquest. It is about influence, timing, and intelligence. Cleopatra's genius was in understanding that survival and dominance require more than armies. They require psychological mastery, strategic alliances, and the audacity to act decisively in moments of extreme risk. Rome may have been the heart of the empire, but Cleopatra proved that a queen from the Nile could not only survive there, she could shape its destiny. Cleopatra had already proven herself as a master of survival and strategy in Egypt and Rome, but the true test of her genius and her courage came with Mark Antony. The Mediterranean was no longer just a stage for her diplomacy, it was a battlefield of empires, ambition, and betrayal. Antony was one of Rome's most powerful generals, a man whose influence rivaled Caesar's, and his arrival in the East would set the stage for a partnership that could reshape the ancient world. Cleopatra's first challenge was perception. Antony, like many Romans, underestimated the Queen of Egypt. To them, she was an exotic monarch, a beautiful foreigner with wealth but little understanding of real power. Cleopatra used this to her advantage. She approached Antony not with submission, but with calculated confidence. Her knowledge of politics, war, and diplomacy made her a formidable counterpart. Every gesture, every word, every meeting was a careful negotiation of influence. Cleopatra understood that Antony's respect admiration, and eventually love, could be leveraged to secure her kingdom and strengthen Egypt's position in the Mediterranean. Their meeting in Tarsus in 41 BC is legendary, not merely for romance, but for strategy. Cleopatra arrived in a barge lavishly adorned, with sails of purple gold ornaments and attendants dressed to impress. To the world it was a spectacle of wealth and beauty. But to Antony it was a display of power, intellect, and ambition. Cleopatra wasn't there to seduce for pleasure. She was there to demonstrate that she was an equal partner, capable of negotiating, influencing, and controlling outcomes on a scale even Rome could respect. This alliance was immediate in its strategic impact. Antony, enamored and impressed by her intelligence and audacity, allied with Cleopatra, recognizing the value of Egypt's wealth, naval power, and strategic location. The partnership gave Cleopatra access to Roman military resources, while Antony gained a trusted ally and a powerful base in the eastern Mediterranean. Together, they could challenge rival generals, control trade routes, and project influence across regions that had long been contested. But the relationship was more than politics. Cleopatra and Antony understood the interplay of personal and political power. Cleopatra's ability to inspire loyalty and devotion extended not just to armies, but to individuals of immense influence. Antony's support provided legitimacy to her reign, but Cleopatra's influence over Antony allowed her to shape Roman strategy in the East. Their alliance was a symbiotic fusion of intellect, ambition, and power. The struggle for dominance in the Mediterranean required more than diplomacy, it required warfare. Cleopatra supported Antony in campaigns against Parthia and in internal Roman conflicts, providing resources, strategic counsel, and naval power. Egypt's treasury, military, and logistical capabilities became an integral part of Antony's campaigns, making Cleopatra a central figure in the military and political chessboard of the ancient world. Every victory amplified her influence, every setback tested her resilience and strategic foresight. Cleopatra's role in Antony's life also demonstrated her understanding of psychological warfare. She projected confidence, cultivated loyalty, and created an aura of inevitability around her presence. Antony's rivals, both in Rome and the East, were forced to reckon not only with his military prowess, but with Cleopatra's cunning, insight, and ability to manipulate perception. Her reputation became a weapon, a subtle yet devastating tool that extended her influence far beyond Egypt's borders. Yet, the partnership came with risks. Antony's enemies in Rome, particularly Octavian, perceived Cleopatra as a threat to Roman stability and as a foreign queen attempting to dominate Roman politics. Cleopatra understood these dangers and prepared accordingly. She worked tirelessly to consolidate her position, manage Egypt's internal politics, and anticipate the moves of both allies and enemies. Her survival depended on balancing ambition with caution, influence with diplomacy, and power with perception. Their alliance ultimately culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a dramatic showdown that would decide the fate of Rome, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Cleopatra commanded a fleet, influenced strategy, and coordinated with Antony's forces. Yet, the battle exposed the limits of even her considerable genius. Political miscalculations, defections, and the immense power of Octavian's forces forced Cleopatra and Antony into retreat. The Mediterranean was no longer just a stage, it had become a trap. Cleopatra faced the ultimate test, not just survival, but the preservation of her kingdom and legacy against an unstoppable tide of imperial ambition. Cleopatra's struggle with Antony illustrates her extraordinary ability to operate in the most complex and dangerous political landscapes. She was never merely a figure of beauty or romance. She was a strategist, a diplomat, and a ruler who understood the stakes of empire. Her partnership with Antony demonstrated her mastery of alliances, perception, and the art of influence, even when facing the greatest military and political forces of her time. In the end, Cleopatra's story during this period is a testament to her genius. She combined intellect, charisma, and courage to navigate a world where survival and power were inseparable. Antony was a formidable ally, but Cleopatra's true strength lay in her ability to shape events, anticipate threats, and leverage both personal and political relationships to maintain her throne and protect her kingdom. The struggle for the Mediterranean would test her in ways that few rulers had ever been tested, and it would cement her reputation as one of history's most brilliant and audacious queens. By 31 BC, Cleopatra's world teetered on the edge of collapse. The Mediterranean was aflame with conflict, and Octavian, the future Augustus, was consolidating power in Rome with a single-minded determination. Cleopatra and Mark Antony faced an enemy who combined political cunning with military precision, and the stakes could not have been higher. The survival of Egypt, the preservation of her dynasty, the continuation of her life itself. The tension in Alexandria was palpable. Cleopatra's allies were loyal, but fear and uncertainty ran deep. Supplies were dwindling, morale wavered, and whispers of betrayal rippled through the city. Cleopatra had fought wars with her intellect, charm, and strategic brilliance, but the forces now arrayed against her were immense. Octavian's propaganda painted her as a manipulative foreign queen, threatening Rome itself. Within Antony's camp, indecision and miscommunication weakened their position, and the unity that had once been their strength began to fracture. The Battle of Actium was the pivotal moment. Cleopatra commanded a fleet of Egyptian ships, poised to support Antony's Roman legions in a decisive confrontation. Her strategies were meticulous. She coordinated positioning, supply lines, and tactical maneuvers, using the Nile's delta and familiar coastlines to her advantage. Yet, the battle revealed the brutal reality of warfare. Even the most brilliant strategies could be undermined by human error, misjudgment, and betrayal. As the battle raged, something unexpected and catastrophic happened. Cleopatra, facing the possibility of capture and the collapse of her kingdom, made a decision that would shock both her allies and her enemies. She withdrew her fleet, retreating toward Egypt's coast, leaving Antony exposed. Some historians argue it was a tactical choice to preserve the core of her forces. Others claim it was a desperate act of survival. Regardless, the effect was immediate. Antony, isolated and betrayed in the chaos of naval combat, faced defeat and humiliation. News of Cleopatra's withdrawal struck Antony like a thunderclap. He initially believed her gone forever, that the queen he had trusted had abandoned him. The psychological blow compounded the physical one. Antony's forces faltered, morale crumbled, and the Roman fleet under Octavian capitalized on the disarray. Alexandria, once a jewel of wealth and strategy, was now a city on the brink of invasion, famine, and terror. Cleopatra's carefully constructed world seemed to unravel in an instant. Yet Cleopatra's mind remained sharp, even in desperation. She understood that survival required more than heroics. It required diplomacy, negotiation, and perception. She retreated to her palace with her loyal guards, securing the royal family and key treasures. Messages were sent to Octavian, carefully crafted to project strength even in the face of defeat. Cleopatra knew that giving the impression of surrender too soon would invite annihilation. Delaying too long risked irreversible disaster. Every moment was a delicate balance between reality and perception, survival and honor. Antony, desperate and enraged, returned to Alexandria, only to face further misfortune. News of false reports claiming Cleopatra had died pushed him to the brink. In despair and anger, Antony attempted to take his own life, wounding himself with his sword. Cleopatra's swift intervention saved him temporarily, revealing the depth of their intertwined fates. In these final hours, Alexandria was a city of fear, blood, and desperation, its streets filled with rumors, uncertainty, and the heavy presence of an empire's collapse. The fall of Alexandria was not just a military event, it was a psychological battlefield. Cleopatra had to manage the loyalty of soldiers, the fears of citizens, and the expectations of an empire while navigating betrayal, misinformation, and the inexorable advance of Octavian's forces. Her intelligence, composure, and strategic thinking were tested like never before. Even in apparent defeat, she demonstrated that survival was as much about mind and courage as it was about armies. Cleopatra's decisions during this period revealed her brilliance under pressure. She used secrecy, misdirection, and careful negotiation to protect what she could, buying time and space to consider her next move. Every alliance was scrutinized, every messenger vetted, and every plan weighed against the reality of overwhelming Roman power. She understood that failure was not merely defeat on the battlefield, it was the annihilation of her dynasty, culture, and legacy. Yet despite her brilliance, some events were beyond control. Antony succumbed to despair, ultimately taking his own life. Cleopatra faced Octavian alone, confronting the reality that even the most brilliant minds must sometimes navigate impossible choices. The city she had nurtured, the fleet she had commanded, and the alliances she had forged all converged into a single moment of reckoning. Cleopatra's survival and the survival of her lineage depended on courage, intelligence, and the ability to act decisively in the shadow of certain defeat. The fall of Alexandria marked the beginning of Cleopatra's final act, a story of audacity, strategy, and ultimate survival. She was a queen at the crossroads of history, facing an enemy who would not accept compromise, while also balancing the loyalty of her people and the legacy of her dynasty. Every decision she made during this desperate period would define not just her reign, but the memory of Cleopatra in history. Cleopatra's final days were marked by a tension few in history have faced. The collision of survival instinct, political genius, and the looming inevitability of death. After Antony's demise, the Queen of Egypt was alone against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, whose determination to conquer and reshape the Mediterranean world left no room for compromise. Alexandria, once a thriving center of culture, commerce, and politics, now became a city under siege, a stage for the final act of a life defined by power, intelligence, and audacity. Cleopatra understood that surrender to Octavian would not simply mean the loss of her throne. It would mean the public humiliation and subjugation of her family, the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and possibly her own life. She had survived exile, betrayal, war, and political manipulation, but she now faced an opponent whose reach and determination were absolute. In these circumstances, every decision was amplified by consequence. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one weighed for survival, dignity, and the preservation of her legacy. The Queen demonstrated a masterful understanding of perception. She refused to appear weak, even as Roman forces entered Alexandria. Cleopatra conducted herself with regal composure, maintaining the aura of authority that had allowed her to survive countless threats. Her actions were deliberate. She displayed control over her court, over her resources, and over the narrative of her fate. By projecting strength, she forced Octavian to recognize not just her status as a queen, but her enduring significance as a symbol of Egyptian sovereignty and power. Yet, Cleopatra also understood that her survival might be impossible. Rumors suggest that she began planning her final act with strategic precision. Determined not to become a prisoner, a spectacle or a pawn in Roman propaganda, she took control of the narrative of her death. Accounts describe how she used poison, possibly from an asp, a snake revered in Egyptian symbolism, to maintain agency over her end. Cleopatra's choice was both practical and symbolic. A queen who had maneuvered through the treacherous politics of Egypt and Rome would not submit to the indignities of captivity. Her death, shrouded in myth and legend, reinforced her mastery of strategy. By choosing her moment, Cleopatra controlled the final chapter of her story. She transformed what could have been a humiliating defeat into an enduring symbol of dignity, intelligence, and unyielding power. Her passing did not erase her influence. It immortalized her as the last pharaoh, a ruler whose life and decisions continue to captivate historians, artists, and storytellers alike. Cleopatra's legacy extended far beyond her dramatic death. She was a patron of culture, science, and architecture, fostering advancements in Alexandria that made the city a center of learning and innovation. Her political acumen ensured Egypt remained a sovereign power as long as she lived, navigating alliances with Rome and countering threats from within her own dynasty. Cleopatra's reign demonstrated that leadership is not solely about conquest. It is about intelligence, strategy, and the ability to inspire loyalty and respect. Her influence on history is also tied to her unique understanding of diplomacy and perception. Cleopatra leveraged beauty, intellect, and charisma not as ends in themselves, but as tools to achieve strategic goals. She manipulated alliances, swayed generals, and shaped the policies of empires. Even today, her story challenges the simplistic narrative of a queen defined by romance. She was a ruler who combined political genius with survival instincts honed through decades of navigating betrayal, war, and the complexities of power. The fall of Alexandria marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Egypt's incorporation into the Roman Empire. Yet Cleopatra's life ensured that the story of Egypt's last queen would endure. She demonstrated that a single individual, through intellect, courage, and strategy, could influence empires, shape history, and leave an indelible mark on the world. Cleopatra's legacy is a lesson in resilience, political mastery, and the enduring power of perception. Her death became the final act of a life defined by audacity. By choosing her own fate, Cleopatra ensured that she would not be remembered as a conquered queen, but as a sovereign who controlled her destiny to the very end. Legends of her life, death, and the myths that surround them have echoed through history, inspiring generations to admire her brilliance, courage, and unwavering will. Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was a strategist, a survivor, and a symbol of intelligence applied with precision. Her life teaches that leadership is not granted by birth alone. It is earned through resilience, cunning, and the ability to navigate the most dangerous of circumstances. In every betrayal she survived, every alliance she forged, and every challenge she overcame, Cleopatra demonstrated that power is as much about intellect and perception as it is about armies and wealth. In the end, Cleopatra's story is not just about the fall of a dynasty. It is about the triumph of human ingenuity, courage, and strategic brilliance. She faced enemies, betrayal, and the might of empires, yet she left a legacy unmatched by most rulers in history. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, remains a symbol of power, intelligence, and the extraordinary ability to shape one's destiny even in the face of inevitable collapse. Cleopatra's life has been retold for over 2 millennia, but the stories that survive often blur the line between fact and fiction. The queen who once ruled the greatest empire in the Eastern Mediterranean has been immortalized in a way that makes it difficult to separate history from myth. Beauty, romance, and seduction dominate popular accounts, Yet the true Cleopatra was far more than her allure. She was a political genius, a strategist, and a ruler whose intellect and ambition shaped the fate of nations. Understanding how myths grew around her reveals just how powerful her story has become and how much she continues to fascinate the world. From the beginning, Cleopatra's image was politicized. Roman historians, such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio, wrote the earliest surviving accounts of her life. These sources often depicted her as a foreign temptress, a queen who used her charm to manipulate powerful Roman men. But their accounts were deeply biased. Rome had defeated her, absorbed Egypt into its empire, and sought to justify conquest by diminishing the character of the woman who had stood in opposition. Every story of Cleopatra's beauty, her seductive influence over Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and her feminine wiles, was designed to portray her as a dangerous foreigner rather than a capable ruler. Despite this, Cleopatra's intelligence cannot be erased. Ancient texts reveal that she was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply readable in mathematics, politics, philosophy, and science. She could communicate with diplomats, generals, and scholars alike, navigating the treacherous waters of both Egyptian and Roman politics. Yet for centuries, her strategic brilliance was overshadowed by tales of romance and scandal, reducing a sophisticated ruler to a symbol of feminine charm rather than political authority. Over time, Cleopatra became a muse for artists, playwrights, and storytellers. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written over 1,500 years after her death, immortalized her as a tragic romantic figure. Paintings, operas, and novels followed, often emphasizing her physical beauty and personal relationships rather than her political achievements. These stories amplified the myths, creating an image that captivated audiences but distorted historical reality. Cleopatra became a legend, a queen of romance, glamour, and dramatic death, rather than a ruler of extraordinary intellect and courage. Yet some myths hold a kernel of truth. Cleopatra's use of image and perception was central to her strategy. Her elaborate entrances, her luxurious lifestyle, and her ability to charm powerful men were not merely acts of vanity. They were deliberate tools of influence. She understood that the perception of power could be as effective as actual force. In this sense, the myths surrounding her beauty and charisma reflect a reality. Cleopatra wielded influence like a weapon, shaping politics and alliances through carefully crafted public appearances. The fascination with Cleopatra also stems from her status as the last pharaoh of Egypt. She represented the end of an era, the final embodiment of a civilization that had dominated the Nile for millennia. Her life and death symbolized the transition from the world of pharaohs, gods, and independent kingdoms to Roman dominion, centralization of power, and imperial authority. In this way, her story resonates beyond personal drama. It is a symbol of cultural and political transformation, of resistance and adaptation in the face of overwhelming forces. Modern historians continue to reassess Cleopatra, attempting to peel back the layers of myth to reveal the queen who navigated exile, alliances, wars, and betrayal with intelligence and courage. Archaeological discoveries, contemporary Egyptian sources, and critical analysis of Roman accounts suggest a ruler far more sophisticated than the seductive figure of legend. Cleopatra was multilingual, politically astute, and adept at both domestic governance and international diplomacy. She leveraged her charisma strategically, not merely personally, shaping the destinies of nations. Cleopatra's death itself became a mythic event, reinforcing her enduring legend. Stories of her suicide by asp or poison created an image of a queen who chose control over captivity, defiance over submission. The dramatic nature of her death amplified her mystique, embedding her story in cultural memory as a woman who defied the greatest power of her age to the very end. This narrative, though partly constructed, mirrors her life, a careful orchestration of perception, power, and survival. The myths of Cleopatra reveal the tension between reality and legend, between history and storytelling. She was portrayed as a manipulative seductress by those who sought to diminish her achievements, yet these same traits, perception, influence, and strategic charm, were integral to her success. Her story challenges the simplistic dichotomy of beauty versus intelligence, showing that a ruler could combine both to achieve extraordinary power. In the end, Cleopatra's legend persists because it reflects the qualities that make her enduringly fascinating: brilliance, audacity, courage, and the ability to shape destiny against insurmountable odds. She is remembered as both a historical figure and a symbol, a queen whose life bridges myth and reality, whose story continues to captivate imagination, scholarship, and popular culture. Cleopatra's reign was not just defined by grandeur or spectacle, it was defined by strategy. She understood power better than almost anyone of her time, and her genius lay in her ability to manipulate, negotiate, and build alliances that kept Egypt independent in a world dominated by Rome. She didn't rely on brute force alone. She relied on intelligence, perception, and timing. Every alliance she forged, every decision she made, was carefully calculated to maintain her throne and safeguard her kingdom. From the moment she reclaimed the throne, Cleopatra's approach was political precision. She had survived exile, betrayal by her own brother, and the constant threat of assassination. She learned quickly that survival required foresight, persuasion, and the ability to turn potential enemies into allies. Her early strategy involved stabilizing internal politics, securing the loyalty of the military, and managing her court, all while projecting strength that left even ambitious generals wary of challenging her. Cleopatra understood that authority was as much about perception as it was about power. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were more than romantic entanglements. They were masterclasses in diplomacy. Cleopatra knew that Rome's support was crucial, but she also knew that Rome was fickle, divided, and prone to internal conflict. By aligning herself with Caesar, she gained protection, legitimacy, and leverage over her rivals, while her presence in Rome reinforced her status as a queen who could negotiate on equal footing with the most powerful men of the era. Later, with Antony, Cleopatra's alliance was both strategic and military. She provided resources, ships, and political support that made her indispensable, while simultaneously ensuring Egypt remained central to Mediterranean politics. Cleopatra also excelled at manipulation of perception, both within Egypt and abroad. She understood that rumors, symbols, and ceremonies could shape reality. The way she presented herself, glamorous yet commanding, cultured yet formidable, was part of a larger political calculus. Even her supposed romantic relationships were tools of influence. They created loyalty, distracted enemies, and solidified alliances. Cleopatra never let personal desire override strategy. Every choice was a move in a complex political chess game. Internally, Cleopatra was a master of governance. She worked tirelessly to consolidate power within Egypt, balancing the interests of powerful families, military leaders, and administrators. She used patronage, strategic marriages, and public works to secure loyalty. Cleopatra also leveraged Egypt's wealth and resources as instruments of influence, funding armies, fleets, and political ventures that extended her reach far beyond the Nile. Her ability to control both domestic and international affairs simultaneously set her apart from most rulers of her time. Her genius extended to intelligence and espionage. Cleopatra cultivated networks of spies and informants, using information to anticipate threats and neutralize rivals. She understood that knowledge was power, perhaps more than armies or gold. Through intelligence, she could manipulate negotiations, influence Roman politics, and maintain Egypt's sovereignty even when facing forces far superior in number. Cleopatra's mastery of information ensured that she always had the upper hand in situations that could have destroyed lesser rulers. Another aspect of her political brilliance was her ability to turn setbacks into opportunities. During Antony's campaigns and the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra faced overwhelming odds. Yet she used strategic retreats, psychological insight, and negotiation to preserve the core of her power and protect her legacy. Even in apparent defeat, she managed to project control and maintain influence over her kingdom, demonstrating that true political genius is measured not only by victories, but by the ability to navigate crises effectively. Cleopatra's approach to diplomacy was also innovative. She balanced relationships with competing Roman factions, neighboring kingdoms, and internal power structures with a finesse that few could rival. Her understanding of human behavior, ambition, and loyalty allowed her to exploit opportunities and mitigate threats. She knew when to act boldly, when to negotiate, and when to manipulate perception to maintain control over outcomes that seemed impossible. In the end, Cleopatra's political genius was her survival tool, her instrument of power, and her legacy. She combined intelligence, strategy, diplomacy, and psychological insight in ways that allowed her to rule one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations while influencing the course of empires beyond her borders. Her ability to navigate alliances, manipulate perception, and use every resource at her disposal demonstrates that Cleopatra was not just a queen, but a strategist of extraordinary skill. Her story proves that leadership is more than commanding armies. It is about understanding people, timing, and perception. Cleopatra's political genius ensured that Egypt survived as an independent power longer than anyone could have expected, even as Rome's shadow loomed ever larger. Her legacy is a testament to the power of strategy, intellect, and audacity in shaping history. Cleopatra's reign did not simply end with her death. It left an indelible mark on Egypt and the wider ancient world. She was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the final pharaoh who held the dual roles of political leader and divine figure. Her legacy is both tangible and symbolic, encompassing governance, culture, diplomacy, and the enduring image of Egypt itself in the collective imagination of history. In Egypt, Cleopatra's impact was profound. She stabilized a kingdom that had been weakened by internal strife and the constant threat of Roman interference. Her economic policies revived trade, agriculture, and urban development. Alexandria, under her rule, remained a center of learning, art, and science, attracting scholars, philosophers, and engineers from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra's efforts ensured that Egypt's wealth and cultural influence continued to rival Rome even as the empire expanded. She understood that a ruler's power depended not only on armies and alliances, but also on the prosperity and stability of her people. Cleopatra also reinforced the religious and cultural traditions of Egypt, presenting herself as both sovereign and divine figure. She cultivated the image of the living goddess, aligning herself with Isis, the powerful mother and protector deity. By connecting her rule to divine authority, Cleopatra strengthened her legitimacy in the eyes of her subjects, while also projecting an aura of mystique and power to foreign powers. This fusion of politics and religion was a hallmark of her reign, demonstrating her understanding of symbolism as a tool of governance and influence. Beyond Egypt, Cleopatra's legacy extended across the ancient world. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony reshaped the balance of power in the Mediterranean, influencing Rome's internal politics and the trajectory of its expansion. Even in defeat, her ability to negotiate, manipulate perception, and exert influence over Roman leaders ensured that Egypt's story remained central to the narrative of imperial politics. Cleopatra's life demonstrated that a single individual could exert extraordinary influence over events that spanned continents. Cleopatra's legacy is also deeply tied to the power of her image. Over centuries, her story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and drama. She became a symbol of intelligence, ambition, and female power, challenging cultural norms and expectations. While some depictions emphasized her beauty and romantic exploits, others celebrated her political acumen, her mastery of strategy, and her resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story continues to captivate historians, artists, and storytellers because it combines human drama, genius, and tragedy in a way few lives have matched. Her life also left lessons in leadership. Cleopatra showed that power is multifaceted. It relies not only on military might, but also on intelligence, diplomacy, psychological insight, and perception. She understood that survival required flexibility, foresight, and the ability to leverage every available resource. Her political genius allowed her to maintain Egypt's independence longer than almost anyone anticipated, navigating threats from both within and outside her kingdom with skill that resonates even today. Moreover, Cleopatra's legacy challenges the simplistic narratives often applied to women in history. She was not merely a seductress or a figure defined by romantic entanglements. She was a ruler who combined intellect, strategy, and charisma to shape the destiny of nations. Her alliances, wars, and political maneuvers illustrate that leadership is about influence, foresight, and decisiveness, regardless of gender. Cleopatra's story remains a powerful example of female authority in a male-dominated world, inspiring generations to re-examine the role of women in history and politics. Even in the aftermath of Roman conquest, Cleopatra's influence persisted. Egypt's integration into the Roman Empire did not erase her contributions or her cultural legacy. The architectural, scientific, and political innovations fostered during her reign continued to shape the region for centuries. Cleopatra's life became a bridge between the classical civilizations of Egypt and Rome, her story illustrating the complexities of cultural exchange, power dynamics, and leadership in the ancient world. Ultimately, Cleopatra's legacy is both historical and symbolic. She was the last pharaoh who embodied the power, intelligence, and mystique of ancient Egypt, while simultaneously navigating the ruthless politics of Rome. She demonstrated that survival and influence depend not solely on strength, but on strategic vision, psychological mastery, and the ability to command loyalty and respect. Her life, death, and the myths surrounding her continue to shape our understanding of leadership, power, and the human capacity to shape destiny. Cleopatra's life is a masterclass in what it means to be a woman in power, long before the concept of feminism existed. She ruled in a world dominated by men, where empires were forged and destroyed through warfare, politics, and betrayal. And yet, she not only survived but thrived, shaping the course of history while asserting authority in ways that few women of her era could even imagine. Her story continues to inspire leaders, strategists, and women seeking agency in male-dominated spaces. From the start, Cleopatra understood that her identity as a woman could be both a challenge and a tool. Many in Rome and even in her own court underestimated her because of her gender. They assumed that a queen was a figurehead, someone whose influence would be limited to ceremonial functions or private matters. Cleopatra flipped this assumption on its head. She leveraged her perceived vulnerability to disarm enemies, while simultaneously projecting intelligence, charisma, and strategic acumen. Every alliance, every negotiation, every public appearance was calculated to demonstrate authority without appearing threatening in ways that might provoke opposition. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony illustrate this duality. Cleopatra navigated personal relationships that were intertwined with political strategy, using them to protect Egypt and expand her influence. But it's important to recognize that these alliances were never about dependency. They were partnerships where she maintained control over her kingdom's destiny. She understood that influence could be exerted through intellect, charm, and perception, not just military force. In doing so, Cleopatra showed that women could wield power in ways that were subtle yet profoundly effective. Cleopatra's influence extended beyond her alliances. Within Egypt, she governed with authority, overseeing administration, the treasury, and foreign relations. She built networks of loyalty, fostered trade, and ensured the stability of her realm, despite constant external threats. Her ability to maintain control over her court, military, and population underscores a rare combination of intelligence, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. She did not merely inherit power, she actively cultivated it, mastering both domestic and international politics in a way few rulers, male or female, could achieve. Her legacy for women in power is multifaceted. Cleopatra demonstrated that leadership requires resilience, intelligence, and the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. She showed that influence can be exercised through alliances, perception, and strategy, not just force or formal authority. For women, her life illustrates the value of navigating societal expectations, using available tools to create opportunity, and asserting control even in environments stacked against them. Cleopatra's story transcends time because the challenges she faced, bias, underestimation, scrutiny, remain familiar to women in leadership today. Cleopatra also redefined what it meant to be a female ruler in the ancient world. While other queens might have relied solely on ceremonial power or male protectors, she combined intelligence, resourcefulness, and boldness to assert her authority. She was a sovereign who shaped the destiny of nations, influenced powerful men, and commanded armies and fleets. Her reign demonstrates that women's leadership can be decisive, visionary, and transformative, even in eras where gender expectations are rigid. Her example has inspired generations across centuries. Artists, writers, and scholars have drawn from Cleopatra's life as a symbol of female empowerment, ambition, and intelligence. She embodies the idea that influence is not granted, it is cultivated, wielded, and defended with courage and skill. Cleopatra's life offers a blueprint for navigating complex power structures while maintaining agency, dignity, and strategic vision. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her influence is how she turned perceived disadvantages into strengths. Being a woman in a male-dominated world forced her to innovate in diplomacy, perception, and alliance building. She transformed what could have been vulnerabilities, her gender, her youth, her foreign status, into tools of persuasion and control. Cleopatra's mastery of image, intellect, and strategy ensured that she remained a central figure in global politics despite overwhelming obstacles. In the end, Cleopatra's story teaches that leadership is not about conforming to expectations, but about redefining them. She demonstrated that power can be exercised through intelligence, strategy, and influence, and that women can command authority in the most challenging environments. Her life remains a timeless source of inspiration, proving that resilience, audacity, and strategic brilliance are not bound by gender. They are bound by vision, courage, and the determination to shape one's own destiny. Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. In many ways, it began anew in the collective imagination of the world. Over centuries, artists, writers, and filmmakers have transformed the Queen of Egypt into a cultural icon, a symbol of beauty, power, tragedy, and ambition. But while many depictions focus on her romance with Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, the truth is far more complex. Cleopatra has become a lens through which societies explore power, gender, and human ambition. In ancient times, Roman historians like Plutarch, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio shaped the earliest narratives of Cleopatra. These accounts, often written to glorify Roman triumphs, emphasized her allure and cunning rather than her political acumen. She was portrayed as a foreign seductress whose influence over Roman men led to moral decay and political upheaval. These portrayals served a clear purpose: to justify Rome's conquest of Egypt and diminish the legacy of a queen who had resisted domination. Ironically, these stories ensured that Cleopatra's image would endure, albeit in a distorted form. During the Renaissance, Cleopatra's story became a favorite subject for painters and dramatists. Artists such as Rubens, Guercino, and Regnault captured her in opulent detail, emphasizing beauty, luxury, and exoticism. Paintings often depicted her death by the aspic, turning her final act into a scene of dramatic, almost theatrical heroism. Literature followed suit, with playwrights drawing on both historical accounts and myth to craft stories that combined romance, tragedy, and political intrigue. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is the most famous example, immortalizing her as a tragic heroine torn between love and duty. In modern times, Cleopatra has appeared in film, television, and popular media, each interpretation reflecting the culture that produced it. Hollywood, beginning with Cecil B. DeMille's 1934 film and famously Elizabeth Taylor's 1963 portrayal, emphasized glamour, romance, and spectacle. These depictions often prioritize drama over historical accuracy, presenting Cleopatra as a larger-than-life figure whose charisma and beauty overshadow her intellect. Yet even through these embellishments, audiences are reminded of her extraordinary presence, leadership, and ability to captivate powerful figures. Cleopatra's cultural legacy is not limited to romance or aesthetics. She has become a symbol of female authority and resilience. Scholars, writers, and historians highlight her intelligence, diplomatic skill, and strategic mind, reframing the narrative to recognize her as a sovereign who navigated one of the most dangerous political landscapes in history. In contemporary culture, Cleopatra inspires discussions about women in leadership, the intersection of gender and power, and the enduring influence of perception in shaping legacy. Her image has also influenced fashion, music, and art, reflecting her status as an icon beyond traditional historical scholarship. Cleopatra's distinctive style, her elaborate hairstyles, regal clothing, and symbolic jewelry has been emulated and referenced in visual arts and popular media for centuries. Even today, she represents a fusion of authority, elegance, and ingenuity, showing that cultural impact can endure long after political power fades. The tension between myth and reality in Cleopatra's cultural portrayals highlights a broader lesson: perception often becomes reality. Cleopatra's genius lay in her ability to control how she was perceived in her own lifetime, and centuries later, society continues to grapple with that constructed image. The blending of history, legend, and artistic interpretation ensures that Cleopatra remains a dynamic figure, one who continues to spark debate, admiration, and reinterpretation. Through art and media, Cleopatra's life serves as both entertainment and education. Her story encourages audiences to explore leadership, strategy, and resilience while navigating complex political and social systems. Even when romanticized or exaggerated, her portrayal reinforces the qualities that made her extraordinary: intelligence, courage, adaptability, and the capacity to influence the most powerful men of her time. Ultimately, Cleopatra in culture is a testament to the enduring power of narrative. She demonstrates how history, myth, and interpretation intersect to shape our understanding of influential figures. Cleopatra is more than a queen. She is a symbol of strategic brilliance, feminine power, and the complexities of leadership. Each depiction, whether in art, literature, or film, adds a layer to her legacy, ensuring that the last pharaoh of Egypt continues to captivate, inspire, and provoke fascination across generations. Cleopatra's life is more than history. It's a blueprint for leadership, strategy, and survival in a world dominated by forces far larger than oneself. Across her decades on the throne, she navigated betrayal, war, political upheaval, and the relentless ambitions of empires. Her story teaches us that power is not only about armies, wealth, or alliances. It is about intelligence, perception, timing, and courage. One of the first lessons Cleopatra offers is the importance of mastering perception. She understood that people act not only on facts, but on what they believe is true. By presenting herself as both divine and formidable, Cleopatra controlled how allies, enemies, and citizens perceived her power. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just political maneuvers, they were also performances that reinforced her authority. The lesson: in any arena of influence, perception can be as critical as reality. Cleopatra also demonstrates the power of strategic alliances. She knew that Egypt alone could not withstand Rome's expansion. Instead of relying solely on her military, she aligned with the most powerful men of the time. But these relationships were not passive or dependent. Cleopatra remained in control, leveraging her partnerships to protect Egypt's sovereignty and secure her dynasty. Her story reminds leaders that alliances are tools for mutual benefit, not concessions of power. Another vital lesson is adaptability in the face of adversity. Cleopatra survived exile, familial betrayal, foreign invasions, and political intrigue. Each crisis was met, not with panic, but with calculated response. She understood that the most successful leaders adapt to changing circumstances, anticipate threats, and turn obstacles into opportunities. Flexibility, intelligence, and decisiveness allowed her to navigate challenges that could have destroyed lesser rulers. Cleopatra's life also underscores the importance of knowledge and intelligence as forms of power. She spoke multiple languages, understood the politics of Rome and Egypt, and cultivated networks of spies and informants. Her insight into human nature allowed her to anticipate actions, manipulate situations, and protect her kingdom. The lesson: information is power, and those who can collect, interpret, and act on knowledge hold an advantage that often outweighs sheer force. Perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra exemplifies agency and self-determination.
In the final days of her life, she chose her own fate rather than submit to Octavian. Her death, while tragic, was also a declaration of control, a final act that preserved her dignity and shaped her enduring legend. Leadership, Cleopatra teaches us, is about making decisions even under extreme pressure and ensuring that one's choices define the narrative rather than letting others dictate it. Cleopatra's story also offers lessons in resilience and vision. She faced enemies more numerous and powerful than her kingdom and yet maintained a focus on long-term objectives, preserving Egypt's independence, securing her dynasty, and asserting her authority on the global stage. Her ability to stay committed to her vision, even when the odds were overwhelming, illustrates the value of resilience and clarity in leadership. Finally, Cleopatra's life reminds us that legacy matters. Every decision she made, political, military, or personal, was intertwined with the image she projected and the impact she would leave behind. By controlling how she was perceived in life and orchestrating her final act in death, she ensured her story would resonate across millennia. Leaders today can learn that legacy is not accidental, it is shaped by actions, decisions, and the careful cultivation of influence. In conclusion, Cleopatra's life is a powerful study in the art of leadership. She combined intelligence, strategy, diplomacy, and psychological insight to rule a kingdom, influence empires, and endure as one of history's most remarkable figures. Her story teaches that power is multifaceted, influence is essential, perception is critical, and resilience is non-negotiable. Cleopatra was not just a queen of Egypt, she was a strategist, a diplomat, and a master of legacy. Her life remains a guide for anyone seeking to navigate complex challenges, shape outcomes, and leave an enduring mark on the world. Thank you for following Cleopatra's journey through history. From her rise to power, through war, diplomacy, and survival, to her ultimate legacy, her story is a testament to intelligence, courage, and the art of ruling. Cleopatra's life reminds us that leadership is not defined by circumstance but by the choices we make, the alliances we forge, and the legacy we leave behind.